Hello, welcome to this edition of IPA Encounters. My name is John Roskam. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, and IPA Encounters is the special exclusive form of discussion and interviews with some of the world's and Australia's great thinkers about the world we live in today. On this edition of IPA Encounters, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Fred Pawle and Rowan Dean. We'll be talking about the life and times of a great Australian, of a great free speech hero, Bill Leek. I'm coming to you from the Baillieu Maya Media Studio here in Melbourne. Fred is coming to you from Sydney and Rowan from the Central Coast. Let me now introduce Fred and Rowan. Fred has been a journalist for some 30 years. He is a Walkley Prize nominated writer. Fred has published in many journals. He has been a regular in the Australian newspaper and the Spectator Australia, of course, and Fred knew Bill for many years. Rowan Dean is a friend of Bill's. Rowan is, of course, the editor of Spectator Australia. He is the host of the compulsory viewing on Sundays, The Outsiders on Sky News, and he is also an award-winning author. Rowan is just about to bring out in time for Christmas the Canberry Tales, the salacious satire from the Culture Wars. You can pre-order it right now from Wilkinson Publishing. And Rowan was telling me a little earlier that while in the book there are a number of his essays and wonderful columns for the Australian Financial Review, there are also included some columns that were not published. So that will be very exciting. Can I say a few words now about Bill? And I'm reading from the description of Bill's life from Die Laughing. Bill Leek was a portraitist, an illustrator, a raconteur, and one of Australia's greatest ever cartoonists, winning 9 Walkley and 20 Stanley Awards and making the finals of the Archibald Prize for Portraiture 12 times. He spent the majority of his career at the Australian, where he was a daily irritant to 5 federal governments, 7 prime ministers, and countless other political and social luminaries. His cartoon caricatures alone were works of art, but combined with his ruthless front bar humour, they became as funny to his loyal readers as they were devastating to their subjects. Bill's own life was often chaotic, but throughout it he maintained a deep appreciation of beauty, a devotion to truth, and a determination to find happiness. His life is a testament to the humour and optimism that still characterise Australia's culture. Fred and Rowan, what would Bill make of Australia today? Fred.
Well, thanks for that introduction, mate. And just quickly and firstly, I'd like to say thanks so much to the IPA for backing this book. It wouldn't have been possible without the IPA, and your unhesitating support for it was crucial. What Bill would be very like we all are. Bill would be alarmed at what Australia has become in the 4 years since he died. I think there'd be 2 responses. First would be his outward response. There is no shortage of idiocy to which he could satirize brilliantly around today. I mean, it's to use a phrase, it's an embarrassment of riches, really. And as we can see, we can almost guess how Bill would have responded outwardly, because we see it every day in the Australian through his son Johannes. who is almost just as brilliant as his dad ever was as a cartoonist. But inside, I think Bill would be deeply disturbed. I've never met anyone who loved Australia more than Bill did. And to see how divided it's become and how pessimistic it's become would cause him considerable anguish. I mean, Bill had so much faith in Australia, and because it was formed at the end of the Enlightenment, and it always had a fantastic fatalistic sense of humour and a great inclusive culture, and all of that seems to be dying. And I think Bill would despair inside. Bill would despair quite deeply about that.
Rowan, what would be the cartoons Bill would be drawing now?
Well, we've already seen some of them. One of the ones that he got in a lot of trouble for was the SS, the sort of gay SS stormtroopers. And I would pick up on what Fred was saying. I agree wholeheartedly. I'd even go a little further and say that Bill would be very, very depressed. One of the traits of Bill's personality, which is familiar to any creative person or any great artist, is the highs and the lows. And Bill lived life to the absolute fullest at every stage. The highs for him were just phenomenal, and it showed in his work. But the lows for him were to do with what was happening to Australia. He found it, as Fred was saying, he found it so depressing that the Australia that he'd grown up in and loved and thrived in, the kind of bonhomie, the camaraderie, the friendship, the taking the piss out of each other, the flouting the rules, the turning your thumb up, turning your nose up to authority at every opportunity. That was certainly the Australia I grew up in, you guys grew up in, Bill epitomised. And he was profoundly disturbed, as Fred was saying, by not only the things that happened to him, the Human Rights Commission, the Gillian Triggs, all the attacks on him from the left, but more importantly, what it was doing to everyday life in Australia. And he would literally sit there saying, we've got to do something. The most common thing, Bill was a great kind of entertainer, and lunches at his place, out on the deck with all sorts of characters from all sorts of walks of life would be around there, and, all human life was there. And Bill loved that side of Australia. And he would say to people, we have to fight. We have to do something to stop this. This is wrong. And what has happened with basically the authoritarianism that we're seeing from the COVID restrictions, and particularly, but not exclusively, the left-wing premiers, is of something that anyone who's lived or been to Eastern Europe or China, but obviously Eastern Europe, Bill had close connections with Germany, and he knew full well the horror of the kind of Stasi-like, Gestapo-like authoritarianism that can grip a society and can impose fear upon the people, sort of the people dobbing each other in, snitching on their neighbours, afraid to stand up and speak. Bill was all too familiar with that from his family connections with Germany, but more importantly from having spent time in Europe. And that's why he would draw the gay Gestapo mob, because he saw the direct parallels with the intolerance towards anyone who disagreed with the orthodoxy, with the dogma, this demonizing of them. He could see the parallels to the worst kind of regimes in the world, and he drew them accordingly. That's why they hated him.
And Rowan, it's interesting that you should talk about Bill saying we must do something. So what struck me about Bill, and I got to know him towards the end of his life as he joined the IPA, and we'll talk about how he was hounded by the Human Rights Commission. But for an artist, Bill didn't just restrain himself to magnificent cartoons. He came with us to Canberra and gave evidence to a parliamentary inquiry talking about the repeal of Section 18C. He sat there and wrote evidence for the politicians. It was an activism that you don't see from many people in the public sphere. even if they're not of the left. I'm going to ask both of you, Fred, where did that politics come from? Because it was always I'll ask you, was he a political artist? And then where did this desire to do something come from? Because a lot of people would have just sat on their hands and drawn cartoons. He didn't.
Well, Bill got involved in politics as a young bloke because he was essentially a libertarian and grew up with the left, crazy party sort of guy, very, very, all the liberal sort of tropes that you think of. Bill was it, and then when he realised later in life that the left that he had grown up with had become censorious and judgmental and restrictive, he according to other people, he switched sides. He didn't actually switch sides. He joined the side that had continued to value his liberalism. But he went from libertarian to actually classical liberal. And at that point in life, he discovered that, yeah, sure, it's good to be free. That's what John Stuart Mill, and all the Enlightenment thinkers wanted us to be. But they also wanted us to remember that with freedom comes responsibilities. And later in life, Bill realised that it was a double-edged sword. And that's when he became super political. That's when he became involved in the IPA. Until then, it had just been a kind of a lifestyle thing and the crowd that he was hanging out with. But then when he realised, oh, hang on, yeah, freedom isn't just, it isn't a personal thing. It's a societal thing. It's a philosophical thing. And in fact, we have to fight for it and we have to earn it. And, later in life, we were talking about this earlier, later in life, Bill quite remarkably and quite suddenly gave up his alcoholism. He was an alcoholic. But later in life, when things got really serious, as far as I could tell, he simply lost that alcoholic need to get necked. And it was his discovery of classical liberalism that did it. And it was his discovery of people like yourself and like Rowan and everyone at the CIS and various other, and of course the Australian, who backed him to the hilt, and anyone else who felt, who was victimised by or targeted by jihadis, all these various threats on the things that he valued. They all coalesced at once, and if there was one thing that Bill learned at school that he maintained throughout his whole life, and that was never take a backward step, and God knows he didn't.
Rowan, did Bill change or did Australia change? So, where was the left? Where were his compatriots supporting him?
It's a fascinating question, John. So there's a couple of things, and Fred's touched on them. First of all, if you're a satirist or a cartoonist, or indeed any kind of genuinely good or talented journalist or commentator, as governments come and go, your job is not to just agree with whatever the government is doing. Your job is to point to the flaws. Your job is to highlight the inconsistencies. Your job is to point out the long-term ramifications that perhaps the political class are covering up or smoothing over. So that's the job. And that was certainly Bill's understanding of the job. So for all the years when Hawke and Keating were in power, that was fine. He could attack them on various things. Once Howard came in, he was very, very strongly of the left and attacked them. But once the change came with Rudd coming in, and he saw immediately what an absurd and ridiculous character Kevin Rudd was, likening him to Tintin, and Rudd even tried, he just spotted the flaws in this character immediately. So from a political point of view, it was easy for him to make the switch because he could suddenly see how absurd Rudd was and the whole Julia Gillard thing was. But that's at that kind of political level as a commentator, as a satirist, which is what he was. But from a personal level, he never changed. His values were 100% the Australia he grew up in. Be loyal to your mates, take the piss out of authority, have a good time, don't take yourself too seriously, all of which Fred highlights brilliantly in his book, in Die Laughing. The character of the man never changed. Okay, so he went through periods of drugs and alcohol, and he went through the 70s thing. He really was the embodiment of what Australia really went through. Coming out of the 60s, the kind of Barry Humphreys or the Brett Whiteleys, they were all mates of Bill's, and they epitomised this kind of left-wing libertarian, as Fred was saying, kind of we can do whatever we want, hedonistic attitude. And you'll find that Bill really lived that life. But he soon realised, as everybody does as they grow older, the importance of the family values. He as Fred writes brilliantly in the book, you can see that the ebb and flow of his personality as he realises he hasn't been too great to his boys. He needs to sober up. He needs to get his life together. And part of that was he started to look more seriously at deeper issues beyond the art world that had always absorbed him. And it really was almost impossible to have a conversation with Bill where he wasn't referring to some, whether it's some philosophical point of view, some political thing he'd just been reading, some older tome. He was very, very much in love with the idea of exploring politics and what politics meant and how it related to him. So I think, much like Mark Latham, much like others, he didn't shift at all. He grew up, he developed, he matured, all of those things which are normal. But the left decided to go from this kind of freewheeling libertarian. I always, on Sky, I'm always sort of poking fun at Graham Richardson, saying, the Labor Party that you belong to is not the Labor Party of now. And Richo, who was, again, a great mate of Bill Leek's, recognises it. He's got to have a few drinks before he admits it, but he recognises that the Labor Party is not the Labor Party of the 70s and 80s, of the Hawke era, that people like Bill Leek and Graham Richardson and so many others epitomised. And now it is this nasty, petty-minded, vindictive, intolerant, spiteful little power-grabbing group of individuals, most of whom, you wouldn't give the time of day to, people who would struggle to secure any kind of job outside the political machinations of the left. And that the Labor Party has shifted to, it's unrecognisable from what it was in its heyday. And Bill certainly recognised that. And why they hated him so much was because he got the torch out and he shone it back on them. And he said, I used to be with you guys, but look at you now, what you have become. And they couldn't cope with that. And of course, we know the left has no sense of humour. That's the other. Side.
And Rowan, you were about to tell us a Kevin Rudd story, but I won't pull you up on that for fear of defamation laws. But is that why? I won't say, well, you might say the left abandoned him. And this is something we've seen around the world. People nominally of the left then come to freedom and their old friends abandon them, and they are then with a coterie and a group of people who never you would have envisaged 10 years ago would have been with them, or them, I'll say with us. Rowan, is that, Rowan and then Fred, is that what happened that
Bill very much so. Bill's good friends, and there were many of them of the left, didn't abandon him, his personal mates, some of his drinking buddies and others. They didn't particularly, they drifted apart, but that could just be, you do drift apart from your mates from when you were younger. But apart from them, the left not only abandoned Bill Leek, they sought to destroy him. They came after him with pitchforks. They were not going to allow him to have anything other than humiliation and vitriol. They were vicious to an extent you cannot imagine, because, as I said, he exposed the problems with the left. He exposed the hypocrisies. He exposed the inconsistencies, and better than anyone, he exposed the stupidity of the left and the absurdity, and they couldn't cope with that.
Fred, how did Bill deal with this? Was he ever hurt or upset by this?
Well, he didn't betray those hurt feelings a lot. I mean, he used to quote a friend of his who had been through something similar. And he used to say, Rowan's probably heard this one before too, that someone asked this bloke, how does it feel to have lost so many friends because of politics? And he said, well, I'm a whole lot better off without the, and I'll leave you to fill in the noun there. But I mean, Bill wore it all with fortitude. But one of the things that I encountered while researching the book was just how widespread the misconception was that Bill suffered from brain damage. There was a really convenient explanation.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because you talk about it in the book.
Yeah. So it was a very convenient explanation for the left. Why was Bill such a passionate lefty who absolutely despised John Howard? Let's make no mistake about that. And then suddenly had switched. Very convenient explanation. He fell off a balcony, suffered brain damage, almost died in 2008. And so, his former friends and other left-wing observers just let the story spread that, he was brain damaged. And I met countless people who still believed it. In fact, he wrote about it himself in The Australian, that his transition from hating Howard to hating left-wing politics happened the year before in 2007, and just coincidentally around the same time that the federal government changed from Liberal to Labor. So it wasn't, it had nothing to do with brain damage. The other thing is that he saw the Howard government as the word he described the Howard government the day they were voted in 1996 was they are punishers. He saw them through the old prism of a egalitarian lefty. These are the aristocratic elite, and they are going to punish people for being poor. That's what he told his friend Warren Brown. But by the time 2007 comes along and Kevin Rudd comes in, they weren't punishers, they were social engineers, which in fact is pretty much the same thing. It's a form of elitism, and that's the way Bill saw the incoming Labor government. And again, his principles remained intact, but the government changed, and he continued to take the piss out of them because that's what they deserved.
And in Die Laughing, you've included some of the very strong cartoons he did of Howard. And he defined Howard, and exactly as Rowan said, he defined Rudd as Tintin.
One of the interesting sort of subplots of the book is his relationship with Howard. I mean, his relationship with Howard was as extreme as you could imagine. In fact, there was a moment in time when Howard could, if he wanted, could have had Bill sacked. And he didn't, because Howard's not that vindictive. And towards the end of the book, there's this rapprochement between the two, which I look into, and it's quite a charming development in the book, in the character of both men. But you're right, Bill's cartoons about Howard, either published or unpublished, were just plainly vicious. And there's another aspect to the book which I'll quickly refer to, and that is late in life, Bill wasn't averse to apologising to people for his extreme behaviour in the past. And one of the people he did apologise to was John Howard. It's really quite charming, and that's what growing up and developing and becoming, thinking more deeply about things is all about. You can express remorse. One thing Bill never apologised for, though, was the actual humour. So he would, you never apologise for it. If a gag is funny, it is always funny. But if the intention is somehow a little vicious, then perhaps apologies are due.
I'll just say one more thing about Australia and the Australian character before we come on to the book. And Fred, there's a lovely discussion about freedom of speech, or numerous discussions in the book. And you say this: in one of his first political cartoons in a daily newspaper in the Financial Review in 1992, Bill suggested that the worst aspect of freedom of speech in Australia was that it enabled politicians to foist boring television ads on the public during election campaigns. And then you go on to say, and this is important, like most Australians, he saw freedom of speech not as a technically legal right, but as a quality of a naturally mischievous culture. And as he wrote from Europe in 1978, one of the great strengths of Australia is expressed in the way people say, "Oh, bullshit," to everything. As long as people keep recognising and condemning bullshit over there, everything will be all right, I think. And then, as you say, but calling bullshit became increasingly difficult during the rise of political correctness. Did Bill, to both of you, and I'll start with Fred, did Bill's cartoons then change in tenor? As Rowan said, he saw through Kevin Rudd quicker than nearly any other Australian. Did you see a change in the tone of what he did and what he was talking about?
Definitely. Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, one of the defining characteristics of Bill's cartoons was merely audacity. It was just, can I get away with this because it's so funny? Whereas after the mid-2010s, when Bill saw, in his words, bullshit all around him and needed to call it out, that's when things started to get very serious. I couldn't believe it when I found that quote from that letter. That was written in 1979, I think. That quote is very, very central to the book. He wrote it as a young man, and it kind of captures Bill's, it actually does very accurately and specifically captures Bill's love of Australian culture. You know, we call bullshit where we see it. And I'd argue that we probably don't anymore. But to Bill's eternal credit, one of the great things about researching this book, I met Bill in 1994, and I had to do a lot of research about what his life was like before I met him. And I was absolutely astonished. I was reading those letters from, almost 20 years before I'd met him. I could hear his voice in those letters, his style, his attitude, his erudition, his humour, all remained so consistent throughout his life. And that quote in particular, it's sort of lauding the way Australians call bullshit regardless of the consequences, and what a wonderful redeeming characteristic that is that we all have. You know, for him to be saying that at an early age, and for him to pay such a huge price for it later in life, it says a lot about how Australia has changed.
Rowan, can we still call bullshit?
No, not at all. We've lost that. And how prescient was that quote? I mean, most of us back in 1979 weren't even thinking of anything. We just assumed that was just Australia. That's how we were. But to be thinking already that deeply, or more perceptively, because ultimately that's what a creative person is, perceptive. And Bill was so perceptive, not only technically being able to capture the essence of a person, but also perceptive intellectually and capturing the character of a person. And to be able to recognize those strengths of character, not only of individuals, which he did in his art and his work, but of the nation, and to see it so perceptively and so clearly, and to warn. There was the warning. It was right there all the way back. We will lose Australia when we lose that ability. Well, I'm afraid we've lost Australia, and we have lost that ability, and we're going to have to fight to win it back, because until we get back to that Australia, we are a very, very lesser nation than what we were and what we can be. And the problem that we have today, and it's not exclusive to Australia, but we've got caught up in it, is the whole notion of cancel culture, is the whole notion of offence, of causing offence. And Bill recognised instinctively the problems with 18C. The IPA have done a brilliant job, bringing that to the nation's attention and fighting to try and get it repealed, or parts of it revoked. But it is critical. The moment you have, on the one hand, any sense that it is a legal legally wrong or somehow immoral or whatever to cause offense to someone, you have in one fell stroke destroyed creativity, destroyed objective thinking, destroyed the scientific method, which demands that you challenge and question the orthodoxy. You've destroyed the ability to progress. I mean, one of the great ironies is that the left call themselves progressives. They're the least progressive people on the planet. The most progressive thing you can do is constantly challenge and improve by looking at what you've got, holding it up and being rude about it and saying, you think this is a good engine? Stuff you. I've got why does it do this? Why is it clunky? Why aren't we, and that's how we progress, because we take the piss out of what we've already got. And so someone comes up with something better. But we're not doing that anymore. We're sitting there shivering and cowardly, afraid to say anything to anyone because the law will come after us. Or if the law doesn't, those who employ us will come after us. And if those who employ us don't come after us, those who might sponsor or advertise with us or be clients of our company or whatever, they will be persuaded through social media to come after us. So we have this massive machinery now attempting to silence anyone who does call bullshit on what is clearly bullshit. And we see it every time we open the paper and virtually any politician opens their mouth.
And Rowan, is that because, have we allowed this to happen? Is it the case that as soon as we allowed people to be offended and hurt and that then became unlawful, we didn't recognise what the consequences were? Has it been assumed that free speech will always win out? What do you think, and then I'll ask Fred, what do you think has occurred whereby, to use your terminology, we have allowed this to happen?
One simple word, John: education, or rather lack of it. The biggest threat to Australia, in fact, it's no longer a threat, it's a real clear and present danger, is the education of our children. They have been taught to despise the notion of free speech. They have been taught to despise capitalism. They have been taught to despise industrialization, manufacturing, progress. They've been taught to despise the idea of merit, that you can do better and by getting ahead, you'll advance the nation as well as yourself. They've been taught to despise virtually what Fred earlier referred to as the inheritance of the Enlightenment. They have been taught, and this is the real shame, is that people, I can think of many people, even as early as the Howard years, IPA obviously, who were saying, hang on, our education system could be better, our curriculum could be better, et cetera, and we have allowed the left to march through, I know it's a cliche, march through the institutions of education, and we are reaping what we sowed, because we didn't stop it then. We allowed our children to be abused by the left, and they have certainly abused them.
I remember one conversation with Bill about art, and he said to me one of the saddest things that he has seen, not just in art schools, but even in the compulsory art classes of primary school students, that there's no appreciation of the sublime, of the craft. There's no appreciation of beauty. He used the term, it's deep art appreciation now, such as it is to appreciate the deeply nihilistic, which is political. It's not sublime.
Well, I deliberately put the most postmodern painting I could find up behind me, just so I can still annoy Bill Leek. You might be dead, Bill, but I can still have a crack at you, mate. He would loathe that painting. He would be going, get that thing out of here. Where's the technique? Where's the craft? So, he was one of the great Australian artists. And if you wanted a really great conversation with Bill Leek after the politics was over, you talked art. That bloke was a legend.
Fred, what's happened? How have we allowed this to occur? Is it education or something more?
Well, I couldn't have put it better than Rowan. I mean, the key is education. But I just want to go back to one thing about Australian culture, and that is that one of the things that Bill loved most about Australian culture was that we are so rude, we are so abusive. And it's based on the idea that if I take the piss out of you, it's actually a compliment. I am complimenting you that you are robust enough to take it on the chin. And if you swing back at me, then it's all great. We'll have a beer afterwards. And that's, that was one of the great virtues of Australian culture. But getting back to education, I think it's the fact that we don't read the classics anymore. We don't read classical literature. Like, we don't understand. Hypocrisy is so pronounced and so prominent and so overt these days. It makes people who do understand literature, it makes you wonder how it got there. And it's because we don't even understand irony anymore. So I think it's the fact that there is no sort of classical liberalism in our education system anymore, and we don't understand human nature anymore, and we've become tribal as a result.
Fred, I'm just going to ask you one more question about the book, and then we've got some great questions from IPA members. As you were writing the book, what struck you about Bill's life? Is there anything that surprised you about Bill or about Australia or about Bill's friends as you were writing the book?
It's funny you should ask that. There is one thing that occurred to me quite overtly at the end, and that is that Bill just didn't waste a moment. That's what a biographer will probably reach that conclusion. Most biographers probably reach that conclusion sooner than I did, but this is my first book. But looking through Bill's life, he crammed so much into his 61 years. And even when he was, essentially a derelict dad to his two sons, and he was drinking way too much and ruining his what chance he might have of finding love again and all sorts of stuff, and risking his own career at times with kind of reckless behaviour. Even then, his life was still quite exciting. I mean, I used to see him quite regularly when he was in those years of extreme alcoholism. My kids were young at the time, so I wasn't being part of it, but he was living upstairs from me in a block of apartments. And I remember thinking that he actually makes alcoholism seem like a good idea, because he just lived life to the full. And researching his life, I realised that, warts and all, mistakes and all, he wore it all. And I don't think he would have changed a thing. That's actually one of the first things Johannes told me when, on the day he died, I went up to Bill's place to keep Johannes company because he was by himself, and he said, I'm paraphrasing from memory, but he said something along the lines of, look, his excesses, his indulgences have taken their toll. Now he's died of a heart attack, but we all accepted him for who he was, because if he didn't have those excesses, then he wouldn't have been the bloke we knew and loved and now admire.
We've had many questions from IPA members, so we're not going to have time to get to all of them, but what we've done is taken a selection that's representative of the dozens of questions that we've received. The first question to Fred and to Rowan is from a former chairman of the IPA, Rod Kemp, who sent this in. Cicero, said to be the wittiest of all Romans, said, "Humour was a gift, a quality one is born with and is unlikely to acquire." Rowan, I'll go to you first. Is Cicero correct?
That's a great question, Rod. It's a terrific question. Possibly, maybe the opposite is true, that there are certain people who are born without a sense of humour and therefore they never get the chance to develop it. I think we can all develop a sense of humour, and I think with people like Bill Leek, that's what he did. He brought out the humour in other people. That's what Fred captures in his book, this ability to just draw people into his universe, and suddenly you're laughing, suddenly you're smiling, suddenly you can see the absurdity that he shines the light on. And that, I guess, is the real gift. But I think we're all capable of developing a sense of humour if we're open-minded enough. It's the closed minds of the authoritarian collectivist mentality that we're all just, battery hens in a cage, and someone, a boss, a Dan Andrews should tell us what to do and then we'll be all right. Those people are deliberately humorless, but it's a common feature. If you look at stories from Eastern Europe, from the Soviet Union, from Mao's China, the same thing comes through time and time again, the lack of humor, the lack of any sense of humor. So it becomes buried by the population, it goes underground, and that's where you get, people using humor in order to convey dissenting ideas, which is another great thing of humor. But Rod, I think Cicero probably was right to an extent, but I think we all can develop humour if we want to, unless, of course, we're of a certain political persuasion. Then it's hopeless.
Fred, was Bill always funny? Was he always an acute observer of life?
He grew up in a very funny environment. I think his dad, I never met his dad, but his dad sounds like one hell of a joker. And he started working at the post office where his dad worked. His dad was the postmaster. And Bill used to work summer holidays there, and I think he picked up joke telling from a very early age. And I noticed, when I got to know him, I noticed that quite often, Bill would encounter a situation that was kind of custom made for a punchline from a joke that he knew. He was always drawing on his punchlines to make light of a situation. He often also quoted Bill Mitchell, who was one of his predecessors at the Australian as a cartoonist, and Bill Mitchell told Bill once in an avuncular moment, he said, "Mate, a cartoonist only has to be funny once a day, but it's harder than you think." And Bill often quoted that line, and I always thought, "Mate, you're pulling my leg. You are funny once a minute." There was no struggle for him in the end. There's a really nice passage in the book. Thanks to Rowan for giving me credit for it, but I've got to really give credit to Warren Brown, who's another cartoonist. Who was very close to Bill. He had some very astute observations about Bill's sense of humour, about how natural it was and how acquired it was. So again, I love Rod's question and I love the quote from Cicero, but I'm with Rowan on this one. Bill actually did learn to be very funny, and he wound up being one of the funniest people who ever lived. So
this question is from John, which also touches on humour. Parliament today lacks humour and good manners on both sides, and both in federal politics and state politics. And John says, Boris was a hope, which he was, and he's now lost his way. How do we get back a sense of humour and some good manners? Fred and then Rowan.
Well, Rowan touched on it before. We've got to stop taking ourselves so seriously. Bill never did. Bill was the most brilliant man I've ever met. He could play brilliant jazz piano and classical piano. He was an accomplished portraitist who privately sold commissions of portraits to extremely wealthy and, intelligent, artistically refined people. He was a brilliant raconteur. He could hold court in any company. And of course, he was probably Australia's greatest ever cartoonist. And yet I've never met anyone more self-deprecating. So in short, we've got to stop taking ourselves so seriously.
Rowan, nearly every grade column in the Canterbury Tales that's coming out in time for Christmas has a go at politicians. You're a keen observer of politicians. What's happened to them? Is what's happened to them the same as what's happened to us? And can we get back good humour and manners ever?
Well, we have to. And interestingly, I'm going to pay credit here to Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, because they were hilarious as politicians, sharp-witted, great sense of humour, turned a laugh. They took Australia along with them. Keating became too serious afterwards, but at times he had a devastating wit. And to go back to Cicero, great politicians use humour and use wit to make a point, to convey what might be a complex or even a boring political idea, to speak to the public, to get the idea across, to get the irony of what their opponent is doing, the absurdity of what their opponent is doing. they use humour. Great politicians use humour.
Reagan. I mean, he
Absolutely,
was
Reagan.
arguably the greatest exponent of humour and manners.
Exactly. And this is why, going back to the 18C type discussion, if we've now allowed ourselves to always be looking out for causing offence, then we've destroyed the politician's art of being witty and clever and funny in Parliament. And that's a tragedy that has happened, because the floor of Parliament historically has been a place of great humour and great wit, because the ability which Bill Leek had in spades to spot, and Fred used the word, but it comes through in the book, Die Laughing. I mean, even the title, Die Laughing, is there. Irony, the ability to see the irony in a situation that your political person is saying X, but they do Y. You know, they preach this, but they live like that. That is, every human being can relate to that. You don't need to understand humour to understand irony and its fellow sister hypocrisy and absurdity.
So both of you know the media very well. Rowan, does the media allow today space for irony?
Less and less so, and the trouble, and part of the trouble, but not exclusively, is of course social media and this idea of cancel culture, where one little phrase, what the left have done successfully, which destroys humour and free speech, is labelling certain words. If you say that word, you're a homophobe. If you say that word, you're a anti-feminist, whatever it might be, a misogynist, and we can thank leaders like Gillard and Rudd for really making that the modus operandi today. They destroyed humour with that sort of labelling certain words. To certain people say it, and then they're cancelled. And we're living through that period now.
Fred, how did Bill deal with the change in the media's attitude to humour and satire?
Well, he did. He was particularly disappointed with the inability of his fellow cartoonists to back him when he needed it.
Was he philosophical about that, or did he know that they didn't want to risk their jobs, or how did he deal with that?
Well, Bill had a favourite word he used to wheel out in moments like this, and it's pissant. That's how he would describe people who just didn't stand up. You know, Bill's cartoons in the end were him standing up for particular values. Now, his detractors, or the people who were conspicuously quiet when Bill got himself into trouble, they don't really stand for anything. You know, they do publish cartoons expressing a particular point, but they wouldn't die in a ditch over it. You know, these are just sort of superficial principles that they adhere to, mostly of the left, that have, as far as Bill could see, no depth in them, and certainly no humour. Bill, there was a few advantages Bill had as a cartoonist as well. One was his brilliant ability to caricature people, which is drawn from his portraiture. But the other thing that he was adamant about was to have as few words as possible in a cartoon. If he could get away with no words, he'd do it, as long as it could make you laugh. And, you know, you see the people, the cartoonists from the other side, you know, sometimes some of them are writing, you know, little chapters within the cartoon box. It's so dull and earnest, and you see the jokes coming from a mile away. And, you know, Bill was so much better than all of that, and he was so much funnier. So,
but Fred's touched on a good point there, John, that Bill was a really good wordsmith, really, really good. He loved words, and he would choose those specific short little phrases that just captured a personality. And he, you know, when he wrote, he wrote some stuff for the Spectator, wrote some stuff for the Australian. They were great, but he really understood, you know, the craft of drawing, as Fred says, the craft of portraiture, and how to use that to express himself. It was superb to watch.
And Fred, you mentioned things that people would die in a ditch for. One of the things that you capture so well in Die Laughing is not just the discussion around the cartoon upon which the Human Rights Commission took great exception, but that was not Bill's first controversy. Bill, as you say, and explain in the book, had to move house. His family was threatened. His life was threatened when he caricatured Islamic fanaticism, climate change.
Amazing.
Oh, so go.
It's amazing, John, how quickly the left has dismissed the fact that Bill had to move house.
Yeah.
Are
they embarrassed? Are they ashamed of what happened and that they did not stand up for Bill?
I think that if I have to read their minds, I'd just say that they think he was foolish to take on such a deadly foe. You know, that it was reckless to criticise radical Islam because everyone knows what the consequences are. Bill knew what the consequences were, and he knew what the consequences were of not standing up to radical Islam, and that's far worse. So, I mean, I just find it alarming that they didn't. They don't somehow see that Bill made an enormous sacrifice at that moment. But like I said earlier, he just never took a backward step. But, you know, while I was writing the book, I was trying to put myself in his shoes at that time in his life. And it's really quite disturbing. You know, there were legitimate threats made against his life. He had just been married and he had a stepdaughter who was 11 years old at the time, and they all had to move house to a secret location. And at the same time, some of his friends are abandoning him for apparently becoming, you know, too right-wing and too much of a defender of Western civilization. You know, he actually, you know, he got back on the drink a little bit after that, but just before that. But they were particularly dark times for Bill, and I can't imagine surviving them myself. It's pretty alarming.
Rowan, why do you think, as Fred said, the left abandoned Bill at that particular time over that particular issue?
Because they wanted him gone. They wanted him out of their lives, and it was the perfect opportunity for them to say, "See, this is what happens if you go too far. He's gone too far." So this was always the thing. Bill's gone too far this time. You know, he should have stopped there. He doesn't know how to behave. He's not reasonable. And they thought, great, you deserve what you get. You know, so there was no "je suis Bill Leek," which there should have been. You know, just to pick up on what Fred was saying. You know, his stepdaughter came home in tears one day she'd been on the bus on the way to school, and the other kids were saying, "Your dad's going to be killed by terrorists, ha, 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 ha." So that was what he had to deal with a young 11-year-old girl. And normally, if it had been anybody else, we would have had, you know, this is outrageous, this is unacceptable, but oh no, Bill Leek, he's horrible, you know, he's this, that, and the other. And then, of course, he was a racist and so on and so forth. But and Fred can correct me on if I've got the quote wrong, but it's a great line that Bill came out with often. He would say that, you know what, you know, ISIS, the jihadists, they just wanted to chop my head off. These human rights commissions, they want to take my job away from me, you know. So it was he could even see the irony in the situation that the Human Rights Commission were worse than ISIS.
There's another line. There's another line where he went to bed. He did a cartoon of Muhammad, went to bed and woke up with a roaring fatwa.
I've just looked at the time.
On that note,
we've been able to ask 2 questions. There've been so many more questions, and maybe we might even have to come back next year for a continuation of this special edition of Encounters. But before I close, can I ask both of you to reflect and comment on Bill's legacy? His legacy to Australia, his legacy to the causes that we believe in so much. Fred?
Well, when I was writing the book, one of my ambition with the book was to capture not just Bill's life, but the period of Australian history that he lived through. And because in many ways he epitomised every stage of it, growing up, you know, under Menzies as a child, through the 60s, becoming an adult in the 60s, being libertarian in the 70s and so on and so on. And if his legacy is anything, it is that he, throughout his life, he loved Australian culture, but what he was warning us about towards the end of his life was that we are losing what was once fantastic about this country. And he fought hard and often lonely, except for the Australian and the IPA and the CIS and the Menzies Research Centre and so on and all his friends. But, he was the figurehead for the defence of Western civilization for a while. And at times it would have been a lonely fight. And if anything, his warning about Australian culture is now coming true. So his legacy would be fight it or you're going to lose it. Fight for it or you're going to lose it.
Rowan?
Yeah, I think his legacy is that he took all those sentiments Fred is talking about, the ability to call out bullshit and so on, and he turned it into an art form, a great Australian art form. There are great political satirists through history and great cartoonists through history, but Bill Leek is up there with the very, very best of them. He's definitely the best and greatest Australia has produced. He turned the Aussie larrikin into high art, and that is future generations will look back at that. And I think I would also say about the book, it's a great read. It's so beautifully captures Bill's personality and the highs and the lows, the tragedies and the triumphs. I certainly struggle to read certain bits of it without choking up. But above all, he would love the simplicity, die laughing. That was exactly how Bill would want to be remembered for all time.
Fred and Rowan, can I thank both of you? Rowan, can I thank you for your support of the IPA and what we do? Can I thank you for what you do for Australia? Can I remind everyone watching of the Canterbury Tales out for Christmas from Wilkinson Publishing? You can pre-order it there. And Fred, can I thank you for what you have done? I know that Bill meant so much to so many IPA members. They were so invested in his fight, which of course is the fight of all Australians. Die Laughing, the biography of Bill Leek, is a wonderful monument, not just to Bill and his work, but to Australia and to the causes that hold dear. That concludes this edition of IPA Encounters. As IPA members, you've allowed us to bring this to you, you've allowed us to do our work, and you've allowed us to fight for freedom of speech in this great country. Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Rowan. That concludes this edition of IPA Encounters. Thank you for joining this IPA Encounters with Fred Pawle and Rowan Dean discussing the life and work of Bill Leek. If you haven't already, you can buy Bill Leek's biography, Die Laughing, at dielaughing.org.au. IPA Encounters is made possible by our 8,000 members. The Institute of Public Affairs is Australia's strongest voice for freedom, liberty and the Australian way of life. You too can become a voice for freedom by becoming an IPA member. Visit ipa.org.au/join.